The cardinal gods, Ra, Odin, Zeus, Christ, and many more, all have one thing in common. They are easily the most powerful channel merch. Link will as always be in the description, and for said channel merch I would like to thank Streamlabs for sponsoring that. So if you want to check out the channel merch, as I said, link will be in the description, and if you want to make merch of your own, Streamlabs link will be down there too. So without further ado, roll the intro. We see a largely built man walking through the dungeon, with multiple swords strapped to his back. At first it's unclear what his goal is, what he is trying to do. But as it progresses, we see him encounter a minotaur. Minotaurs definitely aren't the calmest monsters in the dungeon, so moments after eye contact, it would attack. This adventurer, this man, would seemingly grab its blade and shatter it with his bare hand, indicating that he should be pretty high leveled. The Minotaur would basically scream out as it would try to attack him hand to hand, but after some time passes, he would take one of the blades off his back, throwing it to this Minotaur. Exactly how many blades he has is unknown, but it would come to fruition. He would start beating this Minotaur at sword combat. Every time one of the swords breaks, give it a new one. And by the end, on the last sword, the Minotaur would be completely blood red and looks infuriated. He would now lead it to the lower floors and then swiftly make his leave. Now we see that after the entire original Minotaur fiasco, Ra had confronted Loki, and as an apology, Loki had realized that her Familia is getting pretty out of hand, especially Bet. She would call on Finn, instructing him to control the Familia more, with him only giving a simple nod. On the other hand, she'd make an offer to Ra. She would explain how she knows Ra's Familia hasn't been lower in the dungeon as of late. So how about he takes his level 4s, 5s, and even higher if he has any, and sends them with his. They could make a dungeon deep dive to the lower floors. Ra would first question this, but he'd allow it nonetheless. On the other hand, he is sending the Sword Princess along, so he'd need to send someone else to help Belle in the dungeon. He'd think to himself when he decided he'd keep back the level 3 adventurer Aisha. She would help Belle for now. They have been running low on funds, only getting mediocre amounts as of late. So he'd confirm and accept this offer of say. So that's what would happen. Ra and Loki's Familia would prepare for the dungeon when we'd see Bel and Aisha heading in. Obviously, the Ra and Loki Familias have not yet head in. They're still strategizing on how deep they're gonna go and what rations they must take or precautions they must take. So, not long after Bel and Aisha had entered, Aisha had pushed him a floor higher than he should be able to go. But somehow they're keeping up. Both him and Aisha are pretty much tearing through the monsters. Obviously, these aren't worth that much, but it's still a good experience nonetheless. Aisha remembers when she could only grind on these lower levels. She'd laugh to herself as she just continue slashing at the monsters. On the other hand, we'd see the Ra and Loki Familias finally heading down. But what they encounter is Bel and Aisha being faced with a large red minotaur, somewhat having man-made weapons. Eyes, who was still with, would try to step in, but for some reason Aisha would stop her with an arm. Bel would not even be thinking about the Loki Familia behind him. He wants his revenge on these minotaurs. Eyes obviously knows what happened last time and could feel the sheer amount of power coming off of this one. It's not the same. But Aisha would hold her back nonetheless. Bel would run toward this minotaur, blocking almost all of his hits, obviously not without recoil. He would be pushed around the ground as each and every hit connects with his Ankh, as he would take a slash with his weapon. He would slowly whittle down the monster as he would see an opening. He would cast Fireball, and as it stumbles back, he would stab where its monster core is supposed to be. But nothing happens. The Minotaur would scream out in a frustrating howl, if you could call it so, slapping Bel to the side. As he regains his footing, he sees he merely scratched the top of it. This curved blade isn't exactly made for stabbing, so he needs to find another approach. He would run towards the Minotaur, and as its sword connects with the Ankh one more time, Bel feels his hand pressing in. He had worried that it might be the Ankh breaking, but what he sees is a small blade coming out the end. This is exactly what I need. Bel would spin around, slicing at the Minotaur's sword arm with his curved blade as he would spin around. Obviously, at this point, the Loki faction had thought Bel would have lost, at least before the Ankh had revealed its blade. They would have think that one of them or the Sword Princess would have to step in and save this kid again. Bet would think that the kid should just die already if he's this useless. But what would happen is the Ankh's blade would be revealed. Bel would slash at the monster's sword arm, spin around, and stab it right through the monster core. But for some reason, this Minotaur wouldn't immediately disintegrate. It would stumble back, falling as something crosses its mind. It remembers the fear it felt when that man started slashing at it. And Bel would feel sympathy towards this Minotaur. He feels its fear. And for some reason, it now fears Bel. Bel appears to be the same man that did this to it in its mind. And now, it's its final moments as it disperses and leaves behind an advanced monster core, something that the previous Minotaur didn't have. This is more like of monsters higher than the 18th floor. We would then see Tiona, Eyes, and Aisha all congratulating Bel on his victory. This was him overcoming a hurdle overall, and his swift use of his sun attacks, or his sun-based fireballs, if you so want to call it, did technically give him an upper edge. He did kind of confuse and disorientate the Minotaur with it, meaning he was at least focusing during training. On the other hand, we'd see that the Loki and Raw Familias now have to leave. Bet would be mad at himself for some reason. Obviously, Bell not having died, him thinking that he would have. He had underestimated the kid, to say the least. The first time was no fluke, but this one could have been. The first time, this kid was terrified. This time he was brave. He was confident in his ability, and he defeated the monster. Exactly what he said, a fluke. But in the back of his mind, he knew that it was no such thing. When Bell would return to his Familia home to get his weekly status update, his grandfather would speak on how he did. In honor of the name Eclipse, he had eclipsed those around him. Level 5s, level 4s, and level 3s in common were all amazed by him defeating that Minotaur. Even Aisha had said that Minotaur was way beyond the level of a normal one. Not even she would have been able to handle it. Basically saying that Bell is on the level of a level 3, even though he's still only a level 2. Obviously, he had not spent that much time in the dungeon to reach a level 2, but all the training with the Sword Princess, Tiona and Tiona, had pushed him a little further. Obviously, now that it comes down to it, Ra would ask Aisha to stick around Bell for a while. He wants to send the Sword Princess on a lot more raids with the higher levels. Maybe they could make a lot better progression in the dungeon. Once again, thwarting their dominance. Or at least other Familia's dominance. And making them once again superior in all ways. When Ra would look up to the top of Babylon, as he'd say, Freya. Scene would cut to show us time had passed. Aisha and Bell had been training both outside and inside the dungeon. They had progressed by a bunch of floors, easily up to the 13th to 14th floor. And this is where it would get interesting. Seeing as how Aisha and Bell had entered, we see that Ra had actually been along with them. And a lot of gods were with their Familia members or parties from their Familias to see them off into the dungeon. Why exactly? Because their names had officially been chosen as level 2s, that is. We would then see another god, more specifically Lord Takamikazushi, or Lord Take as I will be referring to him from here out. He would also be setting off his level 2s, which would be Oka, Chigusa, and Mikoto. They would head down to around the same floors of the dungeon where Bell and Aisha would be heading. And similar problem than in canon would be brought up. Bell would have a natural fire resistance along with Aisha because of Ra's blessing. Aisha just having the high fire affinity and resistance, while Bell has the sun-based ones, meaning he is extremely resistant to fire, and these lower level fire mobs or fire monsters shouldn't really be able to do much to him. So when it came down to it, something similar that happened in canon where Mikoto's party would run through Bell's, basically having them surrounded by monsters, still happens. Obviously, having a level 3 should make this go a little easier, right? For plot convenience, I'd say no. So Bell and Aisha this time would be overwhelmed by the amount of monsters. Now that there are 2 people instead of 3, it kind of balances it out back to the situation they were in. The amount of pure monsters, even though weren't able to overpower them, were able to overwhelm them. They would feel themselves getting tired and sore as they'd make themselves through the dungeon. Obviously, the collapse had still happened, meaning there's no clear exit off of this floor. When Aisha would remember something. When she had first joined the Raw Familia and went up to level 3, she remembers herself, Tione, and Tiona taking shortcuts, obviously fashioning the staircase. You could skip multiple floors by these holes that you could see every now and then. The safest thing that they could do is make it down to the 18th floor. The low-key Familia should have been there by now. If not, they should be on one of the higher floors. How she had calculated it is that I should have been back in a few hours since they had joined or had entered the dungeon, meaning that they should either be on the 18th or higher. So all they could do was go down and hope to run into them. Both of them are exhausted and can barely walk. Time of them fighting and walking and getting down lower floors would pass as Belle would eventually collapse. Aisha would take it upon herself to take Belle even lower. And eventually, once they hit the 17th floor, both of them are exhausted. Even Aisha couldn't really stand anymore. Belle, from the short period of sleep he had, was able to regain some of his energy, and when monsters would inevitably attack, he would take them out. He could feel his body physically screaming in pain after he had used only a single sunbolt. He can't push. He sees that Aisha had gotten them this low in the dungeon. Now he has to pull the strings further. He would pull her all the way down past the 18th floor, or at least the floor boss, to reach the safe zone. Similar to Twin Cannon, Belle would see the walls cracking as he would start a full jog, and he'd barely make it past the hand of a giant that had came crumbling out of the wall. It looks like he had just regenerated from when the Raw and Loki Familias had taken him out initially on their climb upwards. Interesting. Belle would fall down a chute as him and Aisha would land, to be only faced with the Sword Princess, Eyes. She would look down with a confused look as she asks, "What are you guys doing all the way down here?" Obviously knowing that Belle is incapable of getting down here, especially not by fighting. And by her calculations, the boss should have already respawned, so they didn't take out the boss, did they? Belle wouldn't even be able to respond to all these questions as he would faint. We would later see, upon him waking up, that Aisha had fully recovered, and she had been talking to Eyes. When he himself woke up, he heard the bare minimum. He would hear Eyes talking about how they had sent up some of the Loki Familia members as runners to go get some antidotes. A lot of the Loki Familia members and even some other members in the Raw Familia had gotten poison on the lower floors, and they can't afford to take them up. Obviously, Aisha would explain about how the boss had respawned, barely having been able to cling on to consciousness, and how she don't think they would have been able to survive if it wasn't for Belle waking up. Eyes would put her hands together and lift it up to her chest as she would think, why is this kid so persistent? Why is he so persistent on becoming strong? Why is he so strong? Well, Belle would walk out with not a confidence boost, but a nerve to it. He would feel like he failed. He shouldn't have fainted in the first place, causing Aisha to get that hurt. Eyes would obviously try and boost his morale once again, but it wouldn't work. We'd see that both Eyes and Belle have a weird relationship. I wouldn't exactly say that it's romantical or platonic. It's kind of in between. They care about each other on a weird scale. Obviously, Belle cares for everyone in his Familia as he feels him being the grandson of the Familia god. He feels responsible for all the members. So Aisha getting hurt really hit his ego. But he couldn't be down in the dumps for long as his two favorite big sisters, or self-proclaimed so, Tione and Tiona would arrive. Sorry for the mumbling. Tione and Tiona would obviously try and give him once again a confidence boost as his favorite big sisters are here, self-proclaimed once again. And they would somewhat succeed. They'd say that even though he himself had not been able to carry out the entirety of the voyage down here, he had saved their lives nonetheless, at least
his own and Aisha's, and they thank him for that nonetheless, because even though she should be responsible for him being a higher level and all, she had still fallen on those floors. Aisha at this point would grow annoyed and hit Belle with the hilt of her sword, saying, "Come on, dweeb, we're going on a walk. We're going to talk." On this walk, Aisha would basically get it off her chest, thanking Belle for everything he had done up to this point. He had saved her life, and she knows that she had carried him further down, and if she didn't, both of them could have possibly died. But he had pushed them that bit further. She had fainted on an even lower floor, meaning even more dangerous monsters. He had even proceeded to get them past the boss monster. So, for that, she thanks him. And she thanks him for saving her life. But yeah, that's going to be it for this part, guys. We got about to the 2/3 through season 1, meaning this series is actually doing pretty stably, at least in incline wise. So we are going to be seeing more of this. This is part 2 of What If Belle Joined Raw. Also, I would like to thank Xylo for making the art. I forgot to say this in the last part. Thank you, Xylo. The art for the thumbnails and the characters are all fucking beautiful. And yeah, if you haven't yet, his link will be in the description. Go follow him on Twitter to see more beautiful art like that. And yeah, these videos are somewhat edited by Steak, and our intro and outro is created by the Dragon Lord. So without further ado, roll that outro.
1, 2, 3, let's go!
Subscribe for more.
Yada yada does it.